Okay, welcome to How I Became a Theosophist. We're in the middle of our first international theosophical conference here, and I'm Dan Smoller from the Henry S. Olcott Memorial Library. We do this, of course, to create a little bit of a community among theosophists, and a woman who I've just met, who I've only heard talk at the Mahatma Letters webinar so far. Judy Saltzman?
Yes, Judy Saltzman.
Judy, okay. And so basically what we do is we ask you to share a little bit about, how you came to Theosophy. Like, what was your first introduction?
Well, my first introduction to Theosophy was after I graduated from UC Berkeley with a master's degree in philosophy. And I was very fortunate to get a job teaching at Santa Barbara City College, where recently two teachers from India, Professor Raghavan and Professor Nandini Iyer, had come via Oxford. And they had come to be professors at the University of California at Santa Barbara, but also to teach us and start a Theosophy Lodge there. And I was fortunate in the first faculty reception to see a tall woman across the room to whom I was very attracted for some reason. Her name was Helena Hale. And I went up to her and met her, and she said, "Oh, if you're in philosophy, you have these interests, you must go to Theosophy. You must meet Dr. and Mrs. Iyer." And I said, "Well, what is Theosophy?" And so she briefly explained that it meant divine wisdom, and I didn't understand very much, but I decided to invite them to the philosophy club, and they came, and we discussed with him the moral basis of politics. He was a political scientist, and I was invited to go to a Theosophy Lodge meeting, which I didn't do for some months. But when I finally went to a meeting, the subject was God and reality. It was on basically the first fundamental of the secret doctrine. And it was really the most profound and beautiful lecture I'd ever heard. And I sat for several hours after the lecture talking with Dr. Iyer and drove home late that night. And I began reading Theosophy very seriously. And they'd especially recommended that I read Madame Blavatsky's book, Isis Unveiled. And so I started reading this book, and of course she considers it a synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy. And it's also really a critique of the whole of Western civilization, of both religious fanaticism and materialism. And I started reading one night, and I kept on reading until about 4 or 5 in the morning. And then suddenly it hit me that I had always existed in some form. And I was so overwhelmed by this, I just sat for several hours holding the book. And later that morning, my boyfriend said to me, "I think you're just going crazy." I said, "No, I am actually as sane as I've ever been." And I thought about it all day, and then the next day I thought, how did I ever forget it? How did I ever forget that I'd always existed in some form? So I really affirmed this with poetry I had written when I was much younger, which really was about reincarnation.
But you were not familiar with the concept, or?
No, I was not familiar that time when I wrote the poetry with Theosophy. And I realized, of course, that Theosophy, meaning generally divine wisdom, and going back to an ancient Greek teacher, Ammonius Saccas, who was a teacher of Plotinus, that it really, meaning divine wisdom, is the fundamental wisdom of humanity, the primordial revelation to all humanity. And I thought, well, I need to expand my horizons well beyond the academic to the spiritual. So I continued to study, and I went to Germany to study as a Fulbright scholar, and it was really in Germany during the long winter that I read The Secret Doctrine. And
was that sort of cover to cover?
Yes, it was, but The Secret Doctrine, and it's not a book that you can say, well, I've read it.
Right.
It's a lifetime of study, but this really did open up my thinking from, being a skeptical academic, which I had been for a long time, trying to be a careful philosopher. And also I went through a period of being fairly materialistic, fairly left-wing politically at UC Berkeley, and involved in certain aspects of Marxism, which I had studied. But I realized that I needed to go beyond this, but with the inner sense, which I, of course, could not prove to anyone else in the standard Western scientific way, that we had all always existed, I decided to make this a basis for my life and further development. And I wound up getting a PhD in religious studies at UC Santa Barbara, which, although the faculty were not Theosophists, they were very open to the idea of the unity of all religions and the study of each religion in every way that it should be respected and honored as part of the great teaching of humanity. So I went entirely through graduate school without ever mentioning the word Theosophy.
Okay.
And I never wrote about it until...
Were you discouraged from
No,
writing?
not at all.
Yeah.
In fact, some of my professors knew I attended Theosophy meetings, but I just did not talk about it. It was just not appropriate to talk about my own personal belief. But the philosophers I encountered, one of whom was a German philosopher named Paul Natorp, upon whom I wrote my dissertation, was clearly, in his orientation and deep thinking, a man who wanted to work for the true benefit of humanity. I found out that he was a German Quaker, and he taught the great German philosopher Ernst Cassirer, who had to flee the Nazis because he was Jewish. At any rate, Theosophy really opened up my mind to the idea also that there can be a scientific religion and a religious science, and that also that with when you think about occult science, the word occult meaning originally veiled or hidden, like the book Isis Unveiled. H.P. Blavatsky says there is always another veil to lift after you've lifted one, but that the study of occultism is really very exacting. And whereas science is constantly really changing its ideas through research and development and verification and falsification, Theosophy really does teach that there is an occult truth that can be found, and that when one learns that the path becomes narrower like the razor's edge, and you have to be very precise in your knowledge. And I think that's why as Theosophists we need to be very careful about our study and everything we do. And
would you talk some more about that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I guess St. Paul, whom H.P. Blavatsky said was actually an initiate into the mysteries, that he writes at one point that many are called but few are chosen. I mean, when you encounter Theosophy, I mean, there is this wonderful sense of, oh yes, the rebirth is a reality. There's something in me that will go on forever, and that human beings are all interdependent brothers, that they're constantly the possibility of discovering hidden realities behind science. And yet, one has to realize that unless you develop yourself to be ready for the knowledge and worthy of receiving the knowledge, that you're not going to. And nobody but you can develop yourself.
And is this primarily ethically, or in other ways too?
Well, I think in all ways. In ethics, like the Sevenfold Path in The Voice of the Silence, which is H.P. Blavatsky's translation of part of the Tibetan Book of the Golden Precepts, there is a sevenfold path, and the first of which is dana, which is charity, to be charitable to others. And the next of which is shila, learning to counterbalance cause and effect in karmic action, and the third of which is shanti, patience. And unless you have these beginning virtues, to go on to achieve vairaga, which is detachment from the world, and virya, dauntless energy that fights its way to eternal truth, you're never going to achieve dhyana, the door to meditation, and samadhi, the ultimate faultless vision where the eyes see really intelligently. So it certainly begins with ethics. I mean, you can hardly be a theosophist and let someone you could help go hungry, or be mean to animals, or be willing to kill other human beings for some political reason. So you need to start with ethics, but I think in Theosophy that ethics and metaphysics and spiritual meditation all come together. I mean, it's Raja Yoga, ultimately, that we're doing. And William Q. Judge's last words, of course, he was a very prominent Theosophist and very close to H.P. Blavatsky, one of the founders. I mean, his last words were, "Hold fast, go slow." I mean, we're not going to do all this in one lifetime. So if you're impatient, I had an acquaintance once who briefly studied Theosophy and then said he'd found a guru who offered bliss in 4 months of study.
Yeah, in our study groups here, we get a lot of people who are very enthusiastic and kind of will almost take over the group for 3 weeks or a couple months, and then we never see them again.
They come and they go, and yes, this man said to me, "Well, how long does it take to achieve bliss in Theosophy?" And I said, "We have nothing to offer you but blood, sweat, toil, and tears." Paraphrase Winston Churchill. And I said, when you achieve some enlightenment, your heart will literally bleed for humanity. It is the path of woe. And so if you want bliss, you don't want our company. And that's it, the way it is.
And yet, would you try to describe how Theosophy shapes your life, and how it has shaped your life, and how it continues to? Because you don't seem to be on a masochistic journey, right?
No, I very much enjoy life.
Yeah.
I have enjoyed my studies. I've enjoyed studying and writing since my retirement in 2004 as a professor at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo.
Yeah, I was professor of religious studies?
Yes, I was, in philosophy. And I'm a martial artist. I do Shaolin Kempo, and I keep up the mind and the body. I think are important while we have a body, to keep it in good shape. So there's no sense that any of us want to suffer. I mean, there's enough suffering without wanting it, but we have to be realistic that study and concentration and work does require a certain discipline, and is not always pleasant. But it shaped my life in the sense that I'm a very fortunate person to be able to focus my intellectual energy now on ideas that are theosophical, and to work on behalf of the movement. And I think this International Theosophy Conference is a wonderful development in that more people from the United Lodge are interacting with people from the Theosophical Society of America and the Theosophical Society based in Adyar, India. And that I'm one of the people in my older years who's able to focus energy on this. I am just absolutely delighted to do this.
What would you recommend to a person who's very new to Theosophy? We have a lot of people around here who for some reason or other happen upon, and they come in and they know almost nothing, so to speak, And so what would you recommend, like, that maybe we would say to this person when they say, well, where should I start?
Well, I think a good place to start would be one, listening to others who know more than you, as I did. But then secondly, reading some of the easier general books, such as The Key to Theosophy by H.P. Blavatsky, where she interviews an inquirer, and so many universal questions are answered in that book. And then, of course, The Ocean of Theosophy by William Q. Judge, which is a kind of a synopsis of what is in the secret doctrine, the cosmogenesis and the anthropogenesis. But, you know, also really the injunction that you won't learn this overnight, and it'll take time to really understand, and that if you're really impatient, that, I mean, no profound subject is learned quickly, whether, you know, if it's physics or astronomy or anything you would take in a university. I mean, you study it for some months or some years before you start really learning. And so go slow, but learn, and every day you will learn something very wonderful, really.
Do you think that there will ever be a space in academia on a large scale for Theosophy?
Well, yes, your question implies that at the moment there is not.
Right.
Really, as I said, when I was in graduate school, I never mentioned
I see
the
what you're
word.
saying. Okay.
Not professionally. Some of my professors knew I went to meetings. At one time, I had hoped to write a philosophy of religion text, which included a selection from H.P. Blavatsky. I was too busy and too exhausted to do that. I haven't done it. I think now there are some academics, such as Professor James Santucci at USC, who does study Theosophy professionally. He has a journal, Theosophical History. Although he is very adamant about announcing at meetings, he's come to some of our ITC meetings, that he is not a Theosophist. I think he's more personally a Buddhist. Although he is learned, writes excellent papers. He wrote an excellent paper on Theosophy and the races, which is a very difficult topic, in Novo Religio, a journal about New Age religion. And because there is now in the American Academy of Religion a whole section called New Age Religions. Theosophy is discussed there as one of the so-called New Age religions, even though there's nothing older. Of course, many of the so-called New Age religions claim that. So it is discussed academically, and I have actually read 2 papers at the American Academy of Religion Platonist and Neoplatonist section on H.P. Blavatsky and Neoplatonism, and the other one was called Hierarchy, H.P. Blavatsky and the Hierarchy of Being. And these were accepted and seriously discussed by academics, as that H.P. Blavatsky knew a lot about Neoplatonism, who were Theosophists in their day in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries of this era. And it is discussed, but you know, not in general. I mean, there isn't any chair of Theosophical Studies.
Right.
There will be a chair of Catholic Studies, or a chair of Jewish Studies, or a chair of Sikh Studies, but you're not going to find that. But I think there are intellectually intuitive academics who are sympathetic to it. But tragically, academia does sometimes teach the pure, cold intellect, and you cannot comprehend Theosophy with intellect alone. It takes the heart doctrine, as you know. It takes some heart to fully understand it. And so I don't know when, but I think eventually, with the idea that there is a universal knowledge, that if there really is truth in this universe, that there will be more academics who will begin to think like Theosophists. And I do know people who call themselves Christians or Muslims, such as the distinguished Muslim scholar Syed Hossein Nasr. For all intents and purposes, he is a Theosophist, even though he is formally a practitioner of Shi'i Islam. I mean, his books are amazing, and he was an initiated Sufi as a young man in Iran. So I think these people are very promising, and they are distinguished academics.
That's a good point. And for the final kind of question, would you give your own definition, in addition to divine wisdom, of Theosophy? You can talk about what you think it means, or what it means to you.
Well, to me, I think Theosophy is the path to the heart of what really is in existence in the universe. Call it Sat, if you will, in Sanskrit, being. I mean, it is the path, it is the way to the truth. And on that path to the truth, we have to get rid of a lot of baggage, which is not going to serve us to get there. Yeah.
So it's kind of a long purification.
Yeah, if you've ever read, there are a number of books about this, such as The Razor's Edge by Somerset Maugham.
Yeah, I love that story.
And there is a lot of it in literature, and that's what Theosophy is to me. But I mean, we have to be open that it isn't the same for every person. I mean, we're all divine monads, but according to H.P. Blavatsky, but we're all different. The book Mount Analog by René Dumas, unfortunately, was unfinished because he died. But it actually is a book originally written in French, which follows this idea of climbing a mountain in a dimension that can only be reached by going through a door that opens at either dawn or sunset. And ultimately, there are those who support, those are going to climb all the way to the top of the mountain, and those are only very few selected to reach the top. Unfortunately, he died before he finished the novel, but it's still very worth reading.
Yeah.
Mount Analog, for that reason.
Well, Judy, it's nice meeting you, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much for not just for being here, but for educating us.
Yeah, thank you. I love to talk about what they call religious autobiography, the AAR. In this case, it's Theosophical Autobiography. Yeah, well, the American Academy of Religion is an organization I belong to, and as I said, Theosophy can be discussed there with respect.
Yeah.
And, but they discuss everything there, so that is a hope in academia.
Yeah, and Theosophy seems to be doing okay regardless.
Yes, well, there will always be those who do want to think in a universal way and can approach matters with an open mind. HPB says at the beginning, the secret doctrine, gently to hear, kindly to judge. She doesn't say, this is the absolute truth, and if you don't believe this, you're going to hell or something. She just says, please kindly consider this.
Yeah.
Realizing she's going to take us way out of the way of our ordinary way of thinking for this age, for what we have been taught. But it can be done.
I know I said it was the last question, but you mentioned reincarnation and how your kind of visceral digestion of that really changed your life. Do you think that you were doing these sort of studies in other lives?
Yes. I think that I wouldn't have had the karma to contact Theosophy had I not been with you in previous incarnations. And it was almost as if coming from India through Oxford that Raghavana Nandini found us. In fact, they told us that we were their people, and here we were, California Americans, pot-smoking kids, college kids, and they told us to shape up, and we did. Right. Many of us did.
Right. Get serious. The last question, the last extra question is: what does karma mean to you?
Karma means action in Sanskrit, cause and effect, and it is not deterministic. We are karma, and we determine our own karma. We even chose our incarnations, and no one is responsible for who we are and what we've done and what we will be but ourselves. And we've got to learn that. And we're not going to survive as a human race.
Well said. Thank you. Thank you for teaching.
Thank you. I've got to go to committee meeting.
Okay.